Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're just admitting everyone into the Zoom webinar, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. Thank you for your patience, everyone. We're just admitting everyone into the webinar. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Winnipeg. Thank you so very much for joining us here for this special virtual afternoon with Samantha Shannon. Now, just a few very quick notes before we begin. You will notice that imperfect, automatically generated closed captions are available just by clicking the CC button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll pop that into the chat in just a moment as well. There will be a conversation that'll take place between our host this afternoon, Sabrina Simmonds, and our very special guest, Samantha Shannon. That will get started in just a few minutes. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. So if you do have any questions, or as they occur to you over the course of the afternoon, please feel free to just write those in the Q&A button, which is just at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those as time permits. There is also live chat enabled, so if you'd like to talk amongst yourselves, feel free. And if you have any positive feedback to share about the Bone season or the event, also feel free to write those in, and we can share them with the participants immediately following. Now, we could not be more thrilled to be gathered here virtually for this exclusive Canadian event with best-selling author Samantha Shannon. We're so very grateful to Bloomsbury Books and Raincoast Books for helping to make this afternoon a reality, and so grateful to all of you for joining us as well. Now, before we begin, I would like to mention that I'm broadcasting here from Treaty 1 territory. That is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. McNally Robinson Booksellers as an institution and a building also rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. Now, I'll say a few quick things just about our special guest this evening, or this afternoon rather, and then because I know no one is here to listen to me, I'll turn things over to much more interesting folks as well. So, many of you will know Samantha Shannon from her brilliant book, The Priory of the Orange Tree, and many of you will also know her from the incredible Bone Season series as well. Now, it is the 10th anniversary of the Bone Season, and it's recently been republished in this beautiful, revised, elegant special edition, and that is what we are here to talk about. So traveling back in time so that Shannon can revisit her debut novel. So, your host for this evening is often described as one of the loudest booksellers at McNally Robinson. That would be Sabrina Simmonds, who can also be found screaming about the next best book. When she's not balancing her time between the bookstore and the Winnipeg Free Press, she's tackling her next craft project or rewatching her favorite Studio Ghibli films. Our special guest this afternoon, Samantha Shannon, is the New York Times and Sunday Times best-selling author of the Bone Season series. Her work has been translated into 26 languages, and as mentioned, her fourth novel, The Priory of the Orange Tree, was her first outside the Bone Season series and a New York Times bestseller. She lives in London, where she is joining us, so let's join her and return to the Republic of Scion with this conversation between Samantha Shannon and, of course, Sabrina Simmonds.
Hello. So first and foremost, I just want to thank you personally for sitting down with us today. It is super exciting to have you here. And as a bookseller who has gotten to see your books fly off our shelves, especially during the pandemic, and now having you here sitting with us, it's just phenomenal. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much. It's always wonderful to meet the people who are actually selling the books, because we wouldn't have careers if not for you guys. So thank you very much.
Yes. So I would like to start the conversation off by talking about the Bone Season in terms of, this is a revision. And was it kind of hard to re-access the knowledge since you have written so many more books in the series?
It was a very interesting process, the revision. So I've known that I've wanted to do this for, I would say, about 8 years, possibly more. So pretty much as soon as the Bone season came out. And the reason that I did it was because when I was writing and editing the Bone season, I was not in a particularly good place. And I did not have the ability to fully commit to the edit. Also, it was my debut novel. Our debut novels are rarely our best ones. So I knew that I could do the story a lot more justice when I went back to it, because I feel that I've gained a lot of skill in the past 10 years. And it was always just bothering me that I knew that the first book in the series could be so much better. And that's the access point for the series. That's where people decide whether they're going to follow this whole story or not. So when I went back to it, it wasn't difficult to access the knowledge, I would say, because I live and breathe this series. I'm definitely better known for the Priory of the Orange Tree. But because each Priory book is a standalone, I can pretty much finish it and then move on with what I'm doing. But the Bone season is one big story that I've been working on for an entire decade of my life. So I know it back to front. I pretty much know every detail. What was an interesting process was, while accessing the knowledge was not an issue, it was interesting to not be the same age anymore. Because when I wrote the Bone season, the main character, Paige, is 19 at the beginning of the series, and I was 19 when I started writing it. And my worry was that Paige was not going to sound like a 19-year-old anymore. She was going to sound like a 31-year-old pretending to be 19. So that was the main challenge of it. I worried it was going to lose a little bit of authenticity, perhaps. But then I was like, you know what? In my career, I've written a lot of different voices. I've written a lot of different ages. And I like to think that I have been able to do that with a degree of, I don't know. I think I don't find it difficult to do that. I don't find it difficult to imagine being a different age to what I am. Also, I have been a 19-year-old woman before.
Yeah.
So all I had to do was tap back into that feeling. It's not like I don't remember what it was like to be 19. But yeah, that was probably the only moment where I was like, oh, is this a good idea or not? But no, definitely not a problem accessing the knowledge, because it's all up here.
So speaking to perspectives, the Bone season is written in first perspective from Paige's view, and Priory is written in third. If the two had been swapped, do you think that they'd be very different stories? Could you imagine the two being swapped?
Definitely not. First of all, because I would be very, very reluctant to write a book that had multiple first-person voices. So the Priory of the Orange Tree, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's told from 4 different perspectives. Oh no, my internet connection's unstable again.
Yes.
Am I okay? Can everybody see me?
I can hear you.
I'm back. Sorry. I'm relying on a very wobbly internet at the moment today. Sorry about that. But anyway, so the Priory of the Orange Tree is told from 4 perspectives. And for me, I think if it was in first person, I think it is a really big challenge to write 4 distinct first-person voices. I think some authors can certainly do it, but it is a really, really difficult skill, because the I voice, you have to know, you want the reader to know pretty much straight away whose head they're in. And it's actually very difficult to do that with the I voice. It's easier if you can use their names as you can in third person. I really don't know what the Bone season would be like in third person. It was very strange, actually, when Paige's voice came to me, because when I was a teenager, I only ever wrote in third. And then I was sitting there kind of thinking about the vague idea I'd had for the Bone season, and this voice came into my head very distinctly with an Irish accent and said, I like to imagine there were more of us in the beginning. And I was like, oh, that's weird, because I've never written in first person, and it wasn't really something I thought I would ever do. Mm-hmm. But I think that the series is so shaped by Paige's voice and Paige's perspective. And I think she has kind of like a natural wittiness to her that I think sort of informs the way the story is told, and it keeps the reader quite grounded and perhaps stops them being overwhelmed by the darkness of the story. So I think they both definitely fit the voices I chose for them.
Yes, definitely. Paige's, I loved her internal kind of commentary as she kind of was figuring out what was going on, because as a reader, it felt like I too was figuring out what the heck was happening to her, because she's completely left in the dark. Mm. If you had written the Bone season from a different perspective, who would you have wanted to kind of like get in your head, or get in their head, I guess, and tell the Bone season from?
I think probably readers would have wanted Warden's perspective. But the problem for me is that Warden is not human. So
Yeah.
there are these, again, for anyone who hasn't read the series, there are these humanoid immortal creatures called refs, and they kind of start as the antagonists, but then Paige kind of becomes allied with some of them. And Warden is the main ref character. I would say he is the deuteragonist of the series. But for me, I don't think I could have done justice to Warden from my own human perspective. I feel limited by my own humanity because I just don't think I would be able to capture a character. He's not even just, I think I could write from the perspective like of a character who was human and became immortal. I think I could do that, but I don't think I can write from the perspective of an immortal character who has just existed for such a long time and isn't human. So he wouldn't have the same framework as any human sort of culture or society. I just don't think I would be able to make him believable. So I think if I was going to pick someone, I'd probably pick Jackson, who is Paige's mercurial employer. He's like a sort of a debonair and slightly amusing yet also terrifying crime lord. And he has a really interesting backstory, and more, I think the further you get into the series, the more layers you see to Jackson. So I think he would be, I have technically written from his perspective before. I wrote a little pamphlet called On the Merits of Unnaturalness. So I have been able to write like him writing, which is slightly different from being in his head. But that was a lot of fun. He does have a very kind of fun, sort of flamboyant, distinctive voice. So yeah, I think probably him. It would be a strange thing to be in his head for too long, but yeah, I think he's probably the most interesting.
He was definitely interesting to read through Paige's eyes, at least. His character definitely showed through. Speaking to your writing process, when you sit down to write a book, do you put kind of all of your other projects aside? Do you have so many projects going at once, or do you like really have to like focus in on that one book?
Definitely focusing on the one book. I just don't seem to be able to flip between them. I need to be fully, properly immersed in a world. I would say the longer the book, the truer that is. Something like A Day of Fallen Night, which is the longest book I've ever written. It's like 900 pages long. I had to be so deeply immersed in that in order to kind of keep putting so many words out of me. I had to live and breathe only those characters. And I would say that is also true of the Bone season. I don't think it would feel very jarring to me to go between the sort of fantasy dystopia of the Bone season and then suddenly be in the kind of knights and dragons world of the Priory of the Orange Tree. I just don't think that would work for me at all. I really admire authors who can do that. It just doesn't seem to be possible for me. So it's very much a one project at a time.
When you set to write a book, do you find that you are like a very immersive researcher? I've seen all over your Instagram that you were in Iceland, which I'm so jealous. It looks absolutely gorgeous. Do you usually like really like set yourself into like a setting to kind of get in the mindset of a book?
Yes, and I'm so glad you enjoyed my Iceland pictures, because you could be forgiven for thinking that I work for the Icelandic Tourist Board at the moment if you go on my Instagram, because I've just not been talking about books, it's just Iceland. But the Iceland trip I took was a postponed research trip because I really wanted to go to research A Day of Fallen Night because Hroth, which is one of the countries in the Day of Fallen Night, is quite strongly based on Icelandic history, with also a little bit of Norwegian in there. It's kind of it's the Viking-y kind of Norse country. So I really, really wanted to go there. But of course, just as I was about to go, the pandemic hit. So I was unable to go at all in the time that I wrote A Day of Fallen Night. So this was a sort of, like I said, a postponed research trip, because I am going to be writing another installment in the Roots of Chaos cycle. So I do like to travel if I can. It's obviously a great privilege to be able to do that. I certainly wouldn't say that authors, have to go to places to get different ideas. It's obviously not going to be practical to suggest that. But for me, it's really, really helpful. I like getting ideas from the different places I go, especially from the landscape. And even just if you're writing about a place or, about a country that's based on a place, there's little things that being there in person that you might miss if you didn't actually go there. So just things like sounds and scents and just things that you might not be able to get from Google Maps, although Google Maps can also be very helpful by itself. But yeah, for me, going to Iceland, it was just helpful doing things like, there was a scene in A Day of Fallen Night where the characters are walking on a glacier. Now, I had no idea when I wrote that scene what it is like to walk on a glacier, because I didn't even know how to imagine that. So I just had to do tons and tons of research on glaciers and hope that I was getting it right. But when I went to Iceland, I was actually able to walk on a glacier, which was one of the coolest things I've ever done in my life. And it just gives you more of a sense of, like, the way that the glacier sounded was actually really different to how it had been in my head. And I hope the scene still reads like relatively realistically, but it was helpful to know that because I can integrate it into my next project. So I do get very immersed in the research I'm doing. I try to do different layers of research. So I'll do what I call overview research first. So I'll just do like a general sweep through whatever historical period it is or whatever country I'm talking about. And then I'll do more specific research. So I'll go and read sources. I'll go to museums. I'll go to, I don't know, art galleries, go to the places in person if I can. And yeah, then once I've done kind of all those layers, then I feel like I can start writing about something. So for example, the 5th bone season book is going to be in Italy mostly. And so I did this big Italian research trip last year where I went to like Naples and Venice and Rome. And again, sometimes it's helpful for me to be able to actually walk around the same places that Paige is walking around. It's just things like the layout of the streets. There was this one building in Venice in the bone season, and I got to actually go in that building and see how the rooms connected to one another and, how the rooms are decorated, things like that I wouldn't have known unless I'd actually gone to Venice. So that was really helpful as well.
The settings of both like the Bone Season and Priory are just like so lush and intricate, and I definitely can see the amount of research you have poured into both books independently. If you were able to kind of be in either of settings yourself personally, which one would you prefer? So either Priory or like the Bone Season.
I'm just trying to think because they're both horrendously dangerous.
Yeah.
I suppose if I was amerotic, I'd be all right in the world of the Bone Season. So amerotic is kind of the equivalent of like a mundane, like it's someone who's not a clairvoyant. And they generally get on just fine in the world of the Bone Season, but clairvoyant people do not. So I guess if I was amerotic, I would go in the Bone Season world. Priory, it's not a very safe world on the whole because pretty much every so often a volcano can go off and produce massive fire-breathing dragons which go on to destroy the world. So yeah, maybe not the Roots of Chaos world unless I was very certain about precisely which year I was going to be going in, because I would pick a year that was not during the volcanic eruption and not immediately after the volcanic eruption either. So if I could pick the century that I went in, it's totally fine when the volcano isn't going off. So yeah, I think it's the world of Priory is dangerous but very beautiful. So I'm sure I would enjoy that. And yeah, the Bone Season world, not so much. It's quite dark.
You mentioned picking like the time period. So a part of the Bone Season that really fascinated me was that you picked the year 2059, which to me doesn't feel as incomprehensible as say like the year 2100 or like the year 3000. Was there, like, when you sat down to write it, did you know the year, like did the year play an important part in your kind of setting development?
Yes, it did. It played a really big part in it, actually. So the reason that the Bone Season is set in 2059 is because I wanted to pick a real world event to be the moment where the Bone Season's timeline diverges from our timeline. And I wanted the Northern Lights to be part of the background story of the Bone Season. So I found this event called the Carrington event, which was basically a massive, massive geomagnetic storm that caused auroras to appear basically all over the world. And they were so bright that people thought it was dawn in the middle of the night and they were waking up to go to work thinking that the sun was rising, but it was actually these auroras. And there was like huge interference with telegrams. It was just a massive kind of a massive moment in history. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to make that a magical moment where something happens. I'm going to kind of take this and put a fantasy spin on it. So this is going to be the moment where a door opens between the worlds and the rest are able to come through from their world. And then I decided, okay, well, I don't want to set the book at the moment that happens. I want it to be some way after that. So I basically had 3 options. It could either be the year 1959, 2059, or like 2159.
Yeah.
And I ended up going with 2059. I didn't really want to set it in the 1950s. It just didn't really feel right to me. I also didn't want to set it quite so far ahead as 2159, because again, like you say, it sort of feels a bit incomprehensible at that point. And I think that it almost goes into sci-fi territory, I think, the further that you push it into the future, because I would have had to imagine all these really advanced technologies that can't, I couldn't even have the context to imagine now. So 2059 felt like a good year, because I mean, it is an unusual thing, because when I wrote the book, it's futuristic, but at some point within my lifetime, it's going to become a historical novel, which is kind of strange because it was always meant to be futuristic. But 2059, you can imagine the kind of technology that's going to exist there. I can look up online about the technologies that we don't quite have now, but they think we will in 30 years or whatever. So it felt close enough to be tangible, close enough that a reader isn't going to feel alienated from that, and also close enough that it doesn't feel either like a historical or too much like a sci-fi. So 2059 just felt like the right year for me.
Yeah, I definitely, I loved that it wasn't too far in the future, but I also sat there and I thought, why 2059?
Yeah, it was actually the first question my agent asked me when he read the manuscript was, why 1859? And I was like sweating, because I was convinced that my whole career was riding on this answer, like whether or not the agent was going to take me depended on me answering this question well. And thank God that I had a good answer for him. Like, I could just tell him about the Carrington event. And it did end up shaping the aesthetic of the Bone season as well. So I now have the vocabulary to describe this. But the characters who live in Scion all wear basically dark academia. And I did not have a word for what they were wearing for years. I was like, it's sort of Victorian and a sort of academic-y, but also kind of not. And I could never quite describe it. I wanted the denizens of Scion to look a bit like they were touched by the Victorian era in some way. So they don't wear jeans, like I say, it's sort of modern-ish Victorian. And I realize now that the word for that is just dark academia. So when you're imagining what the people in the Bone season are wearing, that's what they're wearing.
It's great that the 10th year kind of came around this time, because I feel like there is a giant wave of dark academia books, and it's amazing to see that a book written 10 years ago now kind of like really fits, I guess, not the fabs, but like the huge kind of like overtaking of the publishing world right now. So that was fun to see.
Yeah, I think that's really great, and I think it is helpful that the Bone season is fantasy as well as dystopia, because it came out in 2013 originally, and that was just at the tail end of the big dystopian storm. So obviously, when I was bringing it back, I thought, oh God, does anyone care about dystopia anymore? Is anyone going to care about this book? But then I was like, actually, the Bone season is very heavily fantasy as well. I would say it's more fantasy than it is dystopia. So I think that has helped it kind of stay relevant still, hopefully.
I definitely see like the relevance. So you wrote it over 10 years ago, right? When you started drafting it, did you kind of anticipate how large of a series it would become, or did you have like, it's going to be like 2 books, 3 books? Because we're now, I think we're 4 books in, with the 5th book coming out next year, and that's
2025.
2025, and that's not the end yet, right?
No. I always knew it was going to be 7. And I was very lucky that I found a publisher who was willing to do that, because not many publishers, I think, would agree to publish a 7-book series by a completely unknown random person. So originally I did sell it as 3 books, but it was always with the intention of it being 7 books. So if you go back and look at like really early news about the Bone season, it always says like, Shannon has sold the first 3 books in a projected 7-book series. And actually Bloomsbury were very much on board with it being 7 books. I mean, they were always very happy to talk about it that way. They advertised it that way. And I think they were actually quite excited about working on a long fantasy series. So yeah, I was really lucky. But I always knew, I basically said to them, it's either going to be 7 normal sized books, or it's going to be 5 massive books. The irony of this is that I went on to write The Priory of the Orange Tree and A Day of Fallen Night, both of which are ridiculously massive. But at the time, I assumed that was ridiculous, so I wouldn't have suggested it. And they said, no, we're happy to do 7. So yeah, 7 it was. And the number 7 is symbolically important in the Bone Season series. So I came up with the idea when I was working in Seven Dials, which is a district in London that features quite heavily in the series. So the 7 was always in my head. Like Paige's gang is called the Seven Seals. There are 7 orders of clairvoyance. There are 7 ref families. So the fact that the number 7 is so prevalent in the series, I think ultimately it made it feel right that it was 7 books. And to be honest, I could in my head extend it to 8 or 9 books. But I'm gonna attempt to keep it at the 7 because I like the symbolism of it.
So because you mentioned how you could write more, do you I imagine you know how the book series is going to end.
Yeah.
Did that kind of come about as you were writing the books, or when you first sat down to write the Bone Season, you knew kind of projection wise where the series was going to head?
I've always known where it's heading, and I've known the key events of every book. So I like to leave a little bit of room for maneuver because obviously my ideas about the series have changed as I've got older. So originally book 5 was going to have a very Twilight-esque pregnancy story in it. And then I was like, no, because that's already been done with Renesmee. So maybe don't do that. And also it was going to be like Paige having like this, half human baby and all that. Basically exactly what happened in Breaking Dawn was going to happen in this. And then I just thought, no, I just don't think that suits Paige as a character, that storyline. I don't. It just doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for her. So I just completely scrapped that idea. So the book 5 I've written is very different from the book 5 I was envisioning when I was 19. But mostly I'd say that at the end of each book, Paige has been so far where I wanted her to be at the beginning. But yeah, I do like to leave a little bit of room for me to discover what happens next.
When you went back to start kind of revising the Bone Season, were there any what kind of challenges did you face re-entering book 1?
It was a really interesting process. First, I mean, I don't think an author has done a revision this extensive before. I might be wrong. I'm very happy to be corrected on that if anyone knows of anyone who has, but I don't think they have. It's a very, very unusual thing to do. And obviously the book had already been professionally edited. So Bloomsbury was pretty much like, okay, well, you just go and do whatever you want because you're the only person who knows what you want to do to this book. So I was faced with this unusual situation where I was my own editor. And I didn't have there was no editor involved in creating the revision of the Bone Season. It was copy edited and proofread at my request because I wanted to make sure I hadn't missed any typos or details or whatever. But the actual main edit was done entirely by me. And I went in knowing several things I wanted to do straight away. Mostly I wanted to bring my writing style in line with what it was in The Mask Falling, which is the most recent Bone Season book, which came out in 2021. The Mask Falling was written after I wrote The Priory of the Orange Tree. So by that, I think when I wrote Priory of the Orange Tree, it allowed me to unlock a slightly more mature style to my writing. And I think that really, really reflects in The Mask Falling. And I had been able to rationalize that to myself because I thought, okay, well, Paige is getting older. She's going through experiences. Of course, it's going to sound like that. And I think the voice works. But the problem is that I think there was too massive a gap between Paige's voice in the Bone Season versus Paige's voice in The Mask Falling. Partly because I've aged by 10 years in that time, while Paige has only aged by about 1 year. So it literally sounds like she's aged by 10 years in the space of a year, which didn't really work. So I wanted to smooth out the writing style. Just when I was younger, I had a very choppy writing style, which it's sort of more like the Hunger Games, perhaps, sort of a bit more sparse, a bit more choppy, a bit more kind of pacey. And now my writing style is a bit more lyrical and I prefer sort of more flowing sentences. I really pay attention to the rhythm of my sentences in a way that I didn't back then. So I just wanted the whole experience to be a little bit smoother for readers. Another massive one I wanted to do was to make the world building more accessible. The Bone Season, the world building, so that it is a very intricate world, the Bone Season, and at the beginning, Paige is already in this world. So I had to find a way to convey that to the reader without it feeling too unnatural that Paige is explaining it to everyone. And in the original Bone season, my way of dealing with that, because I was not a very experienced world builder, the way I dealt with that was to basically spell the entire world out to you in the space of the first 5 pages. And it is so overwhelming that I was getting confused. And I know this world again back to front. And the way when I was reading through it, I was like, my God, like it's so overwhelming. Like she's telling you so much information that is not relevant to the plot. So one of the main things I wanted to do was take the 2 opening chapters and to just spread that information in a more natural way. So you don't hear about the entire world within the first few pages, because that it's just a huge info dump and it was overwhelming. So I took that away. And I put much more care throughout the book into making sure that every layer of the world is explained to you carefully, but also one layer at a time. You're not being kind of overwhelmed by everything at the same time. I also wanted to do a bit more character work on Warden particularly. Warden in the original, so Warden is the character who's been in my head for the longest. He's been in my head since I was 15. And he was actually a character written originally for my unpublished novel, Aurora. During which he was like the epitome of a toxic man, which I thought was very sexy when I was like 15. I had some slightly unsettling views about what a sexy man was when I was 15. I thought that when a man had to be possessive and jealous to be sexy. Obviously now I've taken a crash course in feminism, and I don't think that at all. I do not think jealousy is a good quality. So when I put Warden in the Bone season, I really changed his character a lot. But in the first book, I still felt that there was some of that toxicity was just clinging on a little bit. Now, it does make sense in context, because in the first book, Warden is pretending to be someone he's not. So he's having to put this front on. But there were just a couple of moments where it didn't feel like the Warden I know. Like he's a very like gentle, considerate character. And he would sometimes do things like he would kind of like just kind of grab Paige without her consent. And I was just like, he wouldn't do that. Like and again, I do think that at the time I kind of thought that was sexy. And I just, again, now I don't. So I went through and removed like anything like that. And I did more justice to Warden as a character, because I love him so much and I want the reader to love him too. And in the first version of the Bone season, I was like, no, that's just not it. Like, don't be touching people without their consent. It's just not, it's not what I wanted to put in the book this time. Similarly, I also had, this idea when I wrote the Bone season that all fantasy had to be slightly misogynistic in some way. And I think that was just because I had only consumed fantasy where misogyny was quite prevalent. So there were a couple of instances where Paige, like she would call other women like whore or bitch. And when I read that back to myself, I just found it so jarring, because they're not words I would ever use now to describe other women. They're just, the word bitch just isn't in my vocabulary anymore. So it was actually really lovely to just go back and cut those words entirely. I think that's most of the changes I've made. There were just a couple of scenes where I thought that reading back on them, I was just like, this is just a bit weird, or it doesn't really fit with the tone. I did read on TV tropes that it's something like early installment weirdness, which is where the creator, like be that the author or a TV writer, they are figuring out their own world. So you sometimes get like a first season of a TV show, or like a first book or a first installment of a comic. It feels weird compared to the others. And it's because they were experimenting and figuring out, where to go and what to do. So I think that the Bone season was kind of my example of that. So I basically went back and smoothed away the early installment weirdness, and just a couple of loose ends that I'd put in there that just I didn't end up following for various reasons. So yeah, it should just hopefully feel more accessible, smoother. I did want to lean into Paige's sense of humor a bit more as well. She's obviously quite angry in the first book for very good reason, but she is a naturally funny person, and the situation she's in is slightly absurd. And there were times in the first book where I just thought I was taking myself just a tiny bit too seriously. And again, it is it's rightfully quite serious in tone, the book, but it also is quite a silly concept. So I kind of wanted to lean into that. And there's a moment that I've always wanted to add, which is where Paige and this guy called Julian, who she makes friends with, they just burst into like hysterical laughter over the situation that they're in. And I always wanted to put that in the book, and I was so upset that I hadn't done that. But it is just Paige allowing herself to kind of realize the ridiculousness of the situation she's in. And I think that can, again, really help in a dystopia, for it not to get too overwhelming, for you just to remember that, you know, it's okay to kind of smile sometimes, just to break the general tension of the book. And yeah, there were just a few lines that I've imagined in my head for years putting in. Like I always wanted Paige to say to Warden, "You bought the wrong voyant in here," so that he can then say later, "No, I think you were exactly the right one." So just lines that I was annoyed with myself for not having put in. And the fact that I was able to go back and put those in was just such a huge joy. It was just such a joyful and cathartic process for me.
You're basically just living in your head rent free until you got the opportunity to use them all again.
Exactly. I was always like, "Oh, why didn't you make that joke?" Or "Why didn't you put that?" Just, yeah, why didn't you put that scene in? And the fact that I could do that was just, it was honestly so much fun.
So with the, I guess, repackaging of the Bone season, you got such a stunning cover. Did you get any say in the cover process at all? Were there multiple versions of this new 10th anniversary edition?
No, actually, that was the first version Bloomsbury sent me. And I don't know where they found Ivan Belikov, who is the illustrator, but so for anyone who doesn't know, it's the same illustrator who did the Priory of the Orange Tree and A Day of Fallen Night, and he is just a genius. I think something I really like about his work is that there is this extraordinary sense of movement, and he really got that with the Priory of the Orange Tree and A Day of Fallen Night. Like the dragons on the covers look as if they're moving, they look like they're twisting, even though the image is totally static, but he gets that kind of dynamic sense of movement. And he also did that on the Bone season cover, so you can really see the poppies as like almost like they're swaying, like the wind is going through them, and I think that's just incredible. Bloomsbury does ask me what I think of the covers. I very rarely have any feedback because they're just really good. I have had a rocky situation with this series' cover previously. So I loved the classic original design, which is by David Mann, which is like kind of a dark blue background, and it shows the dials on 7 dials, which I loved those. But basically, when the song Rising happened, they decided to change the covers to these kind of very minimalist ones with a white background. And I hate those covers. I hate them now. I hated them then. I said I hated them then. And at the time, I understand why Bloomsbury did it completely, because at the time there was a trend towards covers where there was like a symbol on the front and a very simple background. But I never thought it fit the series tonally. It was very cold and static, and I just really never liked it. And of course, that trend passed after a while, and it became much more common for books to have these really ornate decorative covers. So I'm really glad that it's had a third chance at having a cover with these new ones, because I think it's just so stunning.
They are beautiful. I can't wait to see what the next 2 revised editions look like.
Oh, they're so, like, I've seen a sketch of them. They're not even finished, and they already took my breath away. That was where Bloomsbury did ask me for feedback, actually, because when they showed me this, we decided that we were going to have a similar thing throughout. So we were going to have iconic buildings from the series mixed with flowers from the series. So they asked me if I had any ideas for what buildings I wanted and what flowers I wanted on the front. And they have taken on board my feedback for that. But I'm really, really excited to reveal the next 3 covers, because they're just extraordinary. They're going to look amazing together.
So you have now had quite a few books published. Do you have a favorite cover of yours, or is that like asking someone if they have a favorite child?
Oh man, I actually think the new Bone season. I think so. I mean, it's maybe a mix between that and A Day of Fallen Night, I would say, because I really like that cover as well. Like something I love about Day of Fallen Night is that lovely splash of hot pink, which I just think it was so ingenious from Ivan. It just, I don't really see pink enough on covers, so I really like that. And I love all the colors on A Day of War Night. I said to them that I wanted to have the sort of snowy mountains on the front, and then we have the volcano on the back. And the fact that they did that, it's just so, it's such an explosion of color and movement, and it's so beautiful. So I would say that, and the New Bone season. I think I just love the New Bone season one so much. It's the first time that I feel like the covers have really captured the atmosphere of the series. And again, I did like the classic ones. I do like those still. I especially like the Mask Falling's classic cover. It's just so stunningly beautiful. But I just feel like these ones really get the series. I feel like it's telling the reader exactly what they're going to be getting.
It's clear that the details and the intricacies have definitely worked themselves like into the cover. Is there like a giant book where you hold and house all the information about the Bone season, or is it all just in your head?
I hate saying this because it sounds so intimidating, but it is only in my head. I will sometimes make notes. Basically, I need to plot visually. I'm a visual plotter, so I need to externalize the plot in order to see how the events flow into each other. So if I am going to write something down, it tends to be kind of a brainstorm of different events that will make its way into the plot. I am very blessed that I have a good memory for my own worlds and world building detail. I do not have an especially good memory for anything else, but I do have a great memory for that. So most of the time I can just tell you like a piece of information about the Roots of Chaos world or the Bone Season world. I think just especially the Bone Season, because I've been living in it for 10 years. To me, it's like just switching to a different pair of glasses. Like I can just switch into Bone Season mode and I can walk through a city and it becomes the Scion Citadel of London or Paris or Paige's version of Oxford. But I do just think it's by dint of living in that world for so long. I'm not convinced I could have done the same when I first wrote the Bone Season.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you ever find you have to fact check yourself as you're like writing away?
Not that often. Like sometimes I mean, very occasionally I've gone back when I've done these revisions, like I've been going back to each book and revising them, and just very occasionally I'll catch a detail and I'll be like, oh, I forgot that was in there. But it's quite rare for that to happen. Like I do have a very comprehensive view of this series and this world.
So before we move on to the Q&A, because I see that there are 7 questions here, I do just want to ask you as a bookseller, what are you currently reading?
Oh man, I'm actually not reading anything because I just finished a book. So I just finished the translation of the Iliad that I grew up with, and wow. I'm about to start Emily Wilson's new translation, because I'm going to be writing a book about the Greek goddess Iris quite soon. And I'm very excited about that. And I really just wanted there to be another translation of the Iliad by a woman before I wrote that, because there is already a translation by a woman, but I just wanted more than one option. And the fact that the Emily Wilson translation has just come out just as I'm about to start researching this book was just such a coup. Like I'm just so thrilled with that. So I'm really excited. I know, it's so great. I could not have asked for it to even come out at a better month. It's just so perfect. So I'm really excited to get stuck into that and see how it's different from the translations I've read before. And I'm also going to be reading Cassandra Clare's Swordcatcher. Swordcatcher, because I'm interviewing Cassandra at Comic-Con next weekend. So yeah, that's going to be my sort of priority read at the moment.
Fair enough. Okay, so we actually have, I think we have 8 questions in the Q&A. So I will just ask away. From Monica K, they asked, will we ever learn what the 7th card in Lys's tarot card reading for Paige was?
Yes, but not until book 7 of the series. So the cards mostly align with the events of each book. Not exactly, but it's mostly like for example, the 5th card in Paige's reading, you find out what that pointed to in book 5. So they mostly align with each installment. So you will 100% find out what the card was, but not until book 7.
Okay. From Holly McGill, will we see more of Gomezia?
Gomeza.
What does ruling alongside Nashara look like?
So you will see more of Gamesa. So Gamesa has been quite a background figure in the series. So he's one of the joint antagonists of the series. So he co-rules with Nashira, who's kind of the main antagonist. They have completely equal power to one another. So the refs, they have a culture where they have two leaders called the Blood Sovereigns, and one of them has to be a male and one of them has to be a female. That's just how they see it being fair. And they do rule equally, but they rule in slightly different ways. So Gamesa has been based in the Westminster Archon, and he's been working very closely with the main Scion officials like Frank Weaver, like Scarlett Burnish. He works very closely with them to make sure that like the highest kind of levels of power are doing what they should be. Nashira was based in Oxford, so she's had a very different kind of view of humans to Gamesa. Gamesa has been working within Scion, where people don't know that the refs exist, whereas Nashira has been working in Oxford, where everybody does know that the refs exist. So they have had a slightly different relationship with humans. But you will definitely see more of him as the series goes on. Both Nashira and Gamesa are based on figures from Greek mythology, and several of the Bone Season characters have a kind of Greek mythology counterpart. It's not too faithful to the mythology, but there's definitely someone in my head when I think of Gamesa, and someone when I think of Nashira, even someone when I think of Paige and Borden. So the figure that Gamesa is, I would be interested to see if readers can figure out in the next installments. I would say he's mostly going to appear in 6 and 7. He's still quite background in 5, but you will definitely find out more about him, as indeed will the other characters.
Amy says, looks like Bloomsbury has updated when the revision of the other books will come out on their website. When do you think we might get a sneak peek of the new covers?
So yeah, the website should say May 2024. I hope that's what it says anyway, because that's certainly what I thought it was. The covers are still being designed, so I haven't seen the final versions of the covers yet, so it definitely won't be this month, I can say. I'm assuming that they're in the process of being finalized at the moment, but I genuinely don't know when the cover reveal will be. I would assume if they're in May, I guess definitely by the end of the year, I would have thought. But I will check in with Bloomsbury about when exactly that's going to happen, because I honestly don't know.
From an anonymous attendant, they said, the opening line from Paige, I like to imagine there were more of us in the beginning. Does us refer to voyants in general, or specifically dreamwalkers, or something else altogether?
It's voyants. So the entire opening paragraph just refers to clairvoyant people in general. It was interesting thinking about the opening lines, because it's actually the only part of the series that's in present tense. The entire series is, well, I think there's sort of a paragraph at the beginning of some of the books, and sometimes they slip into present, but it's strange that Paige's voice came to me so strongly in present tense, and then I spent the entire rest of the book talking in past tense. So when I was revising that, I had to think about actually making that make sense properly, because I always knew that it was Paige speaking from the future, but I had to think about exactly when in the future it was. So it'll be interesting to see if readers kind of figure out at what point she's speaking at some point.
Speaking about the voyants, sorry, this is my own personal question.
That's all right.
How did you come up with all of them? Did you, like, as you went, you were like, this would be a voyant, or did you kind of like have like a guide in your head as you went?
There was definitely a method to the madness. So what I wanted to do was create like a big magic system based specifically on different types of divination and interaction with the spirit world. So basically what I did was I went and did a massive research spree where I basically found like as many ways of connecting with like the other side in some way. And I decided to just write all of them down and then bring some kind of order to them. So I ended up seeing which ones were similar to one another. So for example, there were types of divination where people use objects, right? Like tarot cards, for example. And then some of those objects happen to be things that are from the natural world, like plants or fire or water or ice. So I put those together and created the augurs, which are named after a kind of divination where you look at the patterns in the flights of birds. Then I did the soothsayers, who use objects like crystal balls, that sort of thing. Then there were the mediums. So For that, I actually used a book called The Book on Mediums by Alan Kardec, who was like a spiritualist writer. So some of the types of mediums are named after Kardec's types of mediums. Then there were sensors who are kind of like they smell and taste the spirit world, that kind of thing. So basically, I just tried to find things that united them so that they were easy to understand. And of course, the 7 orders of clairvoyance, which is the main classification system in the book, is not the only way of thinking about voyance, because it was created by Jackson, who has only grown up in one kind of voyant culture, one country. When Paige leaves Scion in book 5, she actually finds that some people just don't use that system at all. So that was really interesting. But yeah, it was just a big, basically writing them down and then trying to create a coherent magic system out of them.
Amazing. So back to the Q&A, Amelia was wondering, when will the 3rd book of the Root of Chaos series come out?
I'm not going to lie, I have no idea. So I'm not going to be working on the Roots of Chaos 3rd book for a little while. The reason being is that I just really need a break from books of that size, just for, and also I wanted to focus on the Bone Season series for a bit. So each Roots of Chaos book takes me about 3 years to write. And A Day of Fallen Night, I was working on it through the pandemic. And although I love A Day of Fallen Night, it was a profoundly draining process to be working on a book of that size. Because if you think about every single time an edit comes back, you're going through 900 pages, and you don't get a ton of extra time to do that. So I definitely just need to not work on door stoppers for a couple of years, as much as I enjoy it. And also the fact writing The Priory of the Orange Tree and A Day of Fallen Night has caused long delays in the Bone Season series, and I really didn't want to make Bone Season readers wait this long again, because the last one came out in 21 and the next one's not coming out till 25, which is not a position I wanted to find myself in. So I definitely want to write book. Well, actually, book 5 is now written. It's not edited, but it's been written. I want to definitely write Bone Season 6 at least before I write the next Roots of Chaos installment. And I'm also probably going to write Iris before that as well. So I guess I would maybe reasonably start it in a couple of years. But yeah, I will get it out as fast as I can without compromising the quality, but I definitely just don't want to cause any more massive delays in the Bone Season series. So that's my main reason I won't be working on it just yet.
Okay, from Jackie, they said, I first read Priory this year and immediately was so absorbed with the world and characters. It was also the first queer fantasy book I've read, which, my God, if this had existed when I was growing up, it would have saved me a lot of confusion. LOL. I started reading the original version of the Bone Season recently. Do you recommend starting with your revised or the original, or even both?
Please, God, the revision, please, please. So basically, I would really, really prefer that you read the revised versions, because I think they are better. They are written with 10 years more experience. They're written with a lot more knowledge about the series and where it's going, so it should feel more coherent. I would say that if you can't bear to not read both of them, I know some people are completionists, I would not mix the two. I wouldn't try mixing the revisions with the originals. That's the only thing I would say definitely don't do, because that will be confusing for you. I would say choose one path or the other at a time. So if you want to read the originals, like just all of them in one go, and then read all the revisions in one go. Do not try to read like the revised Bone Season and then the original Mime Order and then the revised Song Rising. You're going to be so incredibly confused. But yeah, I would really, if you only want to read one of them, I would really recommend starting with the revisions. So the Bone Season is available now, and the others will all be available together in May. So I know it's kind of a weird idea to kind of resist reading the next installment when technically it's already out there. But you don't have too long to wait, and you will be able to read 2, 3, and 4 like all at the same time when they come out. So yes, I would really prefer that you wait for the revisions if you don't mind which.
So from Amelia, what made you want to be a book author?
I don't really remember a time when I didn't want to be an author. I know that when I was very young, I wanted to be a vet. And then I suddenly wanted to be an author. I think it was really just when I figured out that you could be an author. I think when I was a kid, I didn't fully understand that people wrote books. Like, I guess I must have seen the photo at the back of the book, but I don't think I knew who it was or what their role is. But the second I realized that you could make up stories and share them with people for a living, that was all I wanted to do. And when I remember when I was sort of past, I started writing as a kind of very serious hobby when I was about 12, I think. I had written before that, but that was when I really committed to it, and I was doing it every single day. And I remember I would wish on stars to be an author. It was just my consuming obsession, and it just got more and more intense as I entered my teens. And yeah, I was very, I was published when I was 21, so it's really just, I got to just go straight into that dream career, and I've always been incredibly grateful for that. But yeah, it's just been something I've wanted to do for many years, and I feel very lucky that I can do a job I'm so passionate about.
So from another anonymous attendant, does all of Paige's present tense narration take place from the same time, like she's telling it all together? Or might some of that narration be from later in the series, but not after it ends? Basically, is she talking from the end of the story when she begins telling it, or is she speaking from somewhere along the way?
I'm not going to say it precisely which point she's speaking, but all of them, I imagine that anytime she's speaking present, she's speaking from the same moment, and she's kind of reflecting on the events that are taking place in each book. It's done quite subtly, but it's, yeah, I know now which point that is. There's no reason why you should know at the moment. You can't guess or anything, don't worry. But yeah, it's all at the same point in my head.
From Victoria, are you still feeling / believing that the third Roots of Chaos book will be The Wild Winter, or has another idea taken root?
Taken root, that feels like a pun. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Yeah, so originally it was going to be, there's 2 Roots of Chaos ideas I'm currently toying with. One of them is what I call the Wild Winter book, which would take place in the same kind of time period as A Day of Fallen Night, or just after it. And basically after what happened in A Day of Fallen Night, which was when the fire magic became chaotic, and you see the consequence of that in A Day of Fallen Night. After that happened, the other kind of magic, the magic of stars, became chaotic. And I thought that it would be useful to have that in the series, because then you can really understand the stakes of the world, like what happens to both of these kinds of magic. And I think previously we've thought of Sterren magic as kind of being like the good version of magic, because it's not or certainly when it applies to the dragons, because the dragons born of Sterren are the water dragons, and they are generally in harmony with humans. But it is implied in A Day of Fallen Night that those dragons could potentially not be in harmony with humans if they became chaotic. So I think that would be quite an interesting period to explore. However, I'm also would like to write a book that's set much earlier, which is about Caliber, Cleland, and Eporo, who are the kind of immortal women who first ate from the Cedar trees. And I think probably readers on the whole, because more readers would have read Priory and not A Day of Fallen Night yet, because obviously Priory has been out for several years. I think probably more of my current readers probably want me to write the first Blood book, because they haven't kind of discovered A Day of Fallen Night yet. So I'm kind of having to wrestle with knowing that more readers probably want the book about Caliber and Eporo and Cleland, but also thinking it makes more sense to write the Wild Winter book first, because the Caliber / Cleland / Eporo book would reveal a lot of the big mysteries at the heart of the series. So there would be nothing for the characters in the Wild Winter book to discover if I did that second. So I think it will probably be the Wild Winter book, but also I would like to still write the earlier one as well. So they will both hopefully be coming. I'm just still wrestling with the order, but I think I have also made my decision.
So last question from the Q&A from Amy. When you are writing in your different worlds, do you have people that you bounce ideas off of, or do you wait until it's done and then go from there?
It kind of depends. So I think the only time I'm generally very much a private writer. I don't really have any kind of beta readers or sort of critique partners. I've had sort of sensitivity readers before, but I haven't had people that I just bounce ideas off generally. I think really the first people who see my book tends to be my agent when it's finished. I don't know why. I'm just perhaps I'm just a bit of a control freak. I just like everything in my world to be as it is. And the only exception to that was the Priory of the Orange Tree. So I was working on, and it wasn't even a critique, it was just me showing it to a group of my friends who were fellow authors. So Catherine Webber, Melinda Salisbury, and Lisa Ludiker. And they all basically they asked me to send it to them in installments as I was writing it. So it was like a Charles Dickens kind of way of giving them the story. And it was when I was kind of first working on Priory, and it was the first time I'd written outside the bone season, and I didn't really know if it was any good or not. And I loved their encouragement, because every time I would send an installment, they would ask me for the next one, and that encouraged me to work on it faster. So I kind of credit them with the fact that I ever finished the Priory of the Orange Tree, because it was quite a mountain to climb given its size. So that was the only time when I've kind of actively been sharing a book as it's being written. But I'm such a perfectionist, I don't really like people seeing a book before it's finished, which has made the process of revising the bone season interesting for me, because now it's like the revised version is out there, but also the original is out there, and the original now feels like I've shown people my first draft, which is kind of strangely uncomfortable for me. But generally, yeah, I just like my friends to see it and when it's done, rather than showing them in its early stages.
So I just wanted to personally thank you for, again, sitting down with us today and having this wonderful conversation, and for having a little event with McNally Robinson. And by little, I mean large.
Thank you again for having me. This has been so much fun.
Thank you both so much. It was such a pleasure to just be able to sit here and listen to you talk. And thank you for all your time and your insight, Samantha, as well. I really appreciate it. As mentioned, we do have copies of The Bone Season available here. We also have copies that are signed, which Samantha kindly took care of for us. So if you would like a signed copy, please just get in touch with us here in Winnipeg. I put the link to the book purchase in the chat just a little while ago. And if you just specify that you'd like a signed copy, we'll make sure that one of these winds its way into your hands. It's a fantastic book. We're so very pleased that you could join us and take the time to speak with us this afternoon, Samantha. And thank you, Sabrina, for hosting with such aplomb, as always. And we're very grateful to you for all your insight and for all the evident enthusiasm for both these books and all of Samantha Shannon's work as well that you've demonstrated through the Q&A and the chat. So have a lovely day, all of you, wherever you happen to be.
Bye.